this incident that took place just the night before Jesus was arrested. This was when he was sharing this last meal with his disciples. We read a little while ago what John wrote about that. Let's read what Luke's account says. This is in Luke chapter 22. The story really takes place over most of this chapter, but for the message this morning, we're just going to read verses 24 through 26, just 3 verses. We're in Luke chapter 22, and we're going to read verses 24 through 26. And the title of the message this morning is The Greatest Among You. Luke writes that a dispute arose among the disciples as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and he who rules like the one who serves." Let's read verse 27. "For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves." There's a great story. It's not true. It's a humorous, almost not a joke exactly, but it's a humorous story. But I thought about it this week as I was studying this passage and getting the message ready, and I want to share it with you because it helps me to make a point, the main point that I want to make in the message this morning. The joke goes that the Pope was visiting in America, and after he had made a number of visits, the day arrived when he was supposed to go to the airport to fly back to Italy. And he had a couple of meetings that morning, and they ran a little bit late, so he was in a rush to get back to the airport on time. And so when the limousine arrived to take him to the airport, he told the driver, "I'm running behind schedule, I really need you to drive fast." But the driver was so nervous that his client was the Pope that he got on the freeway and started driving really slow, 30 miles an hour on the freeway. And the Pope says to him, look, I'm going to miss my flight if you don't drive fast. I need you to go faster. Well, this just made the driver more nervous, and he started driving even slower. So the Pope tells him, "Pull over, I'll drive." So the limousine driver pulls over, he gets out of the car, sits in the back seat. The Pope gets out in full Pope regalia, the robes, all of it, gets behind the wheel and starts driving. He's barreling down the freeway at 90 miles an hour. Well, a cop sees this limo zipping past, and so he pulls it over. And when he walks up to the limousine, the window rolls down, and he is shocked to see the Pope behind the wheel. And he peers in the back seat and sees that guy sitting back there. And he says to the Pope, "Hold on a minute." And he goes back to his car and he radios in to the chief. And he says, "Chief, I've got a problem here. I've pulled a VIP over for speeding and I don't know what to do." And the chief says, "Well, what do you mean you don't know what to do? The law's the law, write him a speeding ticket." And he says, "Sir, I'm not sure I can do that. This is a big shot. This is a big VIP." And the chief says, "Well, who is it, the mayor?" And he says, "No." He says, "Well, is it the governor?" The cop says, "No." And he says, "Well, is it the president?" And the cop says, "No." And he says, "Well, then who is it?" And the cop says, "Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure who it is. All I know is he's so important, he's got the Pope driving him to the airport." Now, that's a great story because it flips things around. It turns them upside down, and it supposes that the ordinary common man is a great man, and that the great man is a servant. And that's exactly the point that Jesus tried to make to his disciples as he asked them this question: who is it really who is the greatest among you? We live in a world that is completely at odds with the values of Jesus. I'm always interested to see every year Time magazine picks what they used to call the man of the year. It's the person of the year now. It used to be just men. Sometimes it's women now. But the choices over the years have always been somebody big and powerful. There have been presidents like JFK and LBJ and Franklin Roosevelt. There have been international celebrities like Charles Lindbergh and the original Mercury astronauts, Winston Churchill. And they've not always been even good people necessarily, or people who worked for good. The Ayatollah Khomeini was the man of the year once. Joseph Stalin was man of the year twice, and even Adolf Hitler was the man of the year once. Because when the world thinks about greatness, it always thinks about power and wealth and influence. And so Jesus asked his disciples, and by extension asks us, to think deeper on the subject. And to ask ourselves as children of God, how do we measure greatness? Now, the story we read from Luke this morning really begins earlier in the chapter. In verse 7 of Luke 22, Jesus tells his disciples, two of them in particular, he tells Peter and John, that he wants them to go into the city and prepare a room for the meal that they're going to have together that night, the Passover meal. He tells them that when they get there, they're going to see a man carrying water, and once they see him, they're to follow that man to the room, and that's where the room is. Now, the reason this would be a sign to them is that carrying water back then, believe it or not, was a woman's job. It was very unusual for a man to be doing this, but something about this man, maybe he didn't have a wife or a mom or whatever, so he was doing what women tended to do in that day. And they go to the city, and sure enough, there he is, and they follow him, and there's the room that Jesus has talked about. It's what we call today the upper room. Tradition says it was the house of the mother of John Mark, who wrote the Gospel according to Mark. And it's there in that room that they're going to share together in the supper. And there would have been a place, it's not like these pictures, the Leonardo da Vinci painting we've all seen of this giant oak table with the ornate chairs, and they're all sitting around a table. It wouldn't have been like that. It wouldn't have been that fancy. There would have been a place for Jesus to recline, probably, maybe on pillows, and his disciples would have had places around him. And probably the dispute arose over the seating arrangements. Even to this day, if you go to some kind of a fancy banquet or something where they have assigned seating, you can sort of tell the importance of people by how close they are placed to the person of power, the VIP, If it's, say, for the president, all the people who are there close, they're the really people, who are important, and all the ones who aren't, they're out farther away. That's what happened probably with the disciples. When they got there and saw where they were supposed to sit, Luke tells us that a dispute arose among them. We know that they were preoccupied with power and influence. You remember that the Gospels tell us that at one point the mother of James and John pulled Jesus aside out of earshot of all the other disciples and said, when you come into your kingdom, I want my two sons to have the most powerful and prominent positions. And so when Jesus hears this dispute and he sees what it is, hears what it is that they're arguing about, Luke tells us in verse 25 that Jesus says to them that the kings of the Gentiles, and that means in the non-spiritual world, that's what he's saying there, that those who are in power, they exercise lordship and authority over the people underneath them. They're called benefactors. That word lordship here, it's not talking about the Lord. It's just talking about having power, about having authority. He could be talking here about a CEO of a giant company. He could be talking about a general who has a vast army underneath him. He could be talking about a king who is king over a large kingdom. He's the kind of man that when he says jump, everybody beneath him says, how high? Jesus said that's what greatness is like in the world. People have it and they exercise it to abuse the people beneath them. They exercise it to control the people beneath them. A good example would be, have you seen that movie, The Godfather? If you've seen the movie The Godfather, what you're really watching there is the story of a true life mafia kingpin named Carlo Gambino. Now, unless you're really into mafia history, you may not know the name Carlo Gambino. But he was the king of all bosses of the mafia in New York. He died in 1976. For decades, this man controlled the mafia in New York and by extension, the rest of the country. It's said that at the height of his power, he had scores of New York politicians and police chiefs in his hip pocket, judges, all the rest of it, who did his bidding. Now, I'm telling you all that to tell you that when he died, over 2,000 people packed the church where his funeral service was held. And it was even said that he died in a state of grace. Because in the world, power and money can buy anything. Friends, position, influence. That's what it's like in the world. Have you ever considered that by the world standards, Jesus was a failure? He wasn't powerful. He wasn't wealthy. In many ways, his ministry wasn't successful, at least in the way we measure success. Out of the millions of people who lived in Judea and Galilee at the time of his death, he had about 120 people who followed him. When he stood before Pilate at his trial and the crowd looked on, who do you think the crowd thought was the greater man, Jesus or Pilate? Of course, they thought Pilate was. Who was, in fact, the greater man? Jesus was. Do you get the sense that God doesn't measure things the way we measure them? And that God's definition of greatness isn't the same of ours? Jesus asks this question of the disciples. It's there in verse 27. He said, who is greater, the one who sits at the table being served or the one who serves? It is human nature to want to exalt ourselves, to puff ourselves out. When Teddy Roosevelt died, one of his sons said at the funeral, he said, my father wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He's talking about his dad's ego. Alfred Adler, who was one of the fathers of psychiatry, along with Sigmund Freud, said that the desire for recognition, the wish to be significant, is the dominant impulse in human nature. But Jesus shows a different way. And he says in verse 26 that the great one in the kingdom of God is the one who serves. And then he gives them an example. And while the disciples are still arguing, and this is where John adds the background to the story, while they're still arguing, Jesus picks up a towel, he takes off his outer garment, he gets a basin of water, and he gets down, he kneels down at the disciples' feet and does something that was reserved for the household servant. He begins to wash their feet. If we could have snapped a picture of that in that moment, and you had no idea who these people were, you just saw 12 men sitting down with their feet sticking out, and one man stripped of his outer garment with a towel and a basin of water washing their feet, who would you have concluded was the servant? And who would you have concluded were the great people? We all would say, well, obviously the one washing their feet is the servant. And then Jesus says the most amazing, radical thing. That to be a servant is the true sign of greatness in the kingdom of God. It's what John the Baptist meant when he said of Jesus that he must increase and I must decrease. I was reading this week about one of my favorite preachers from another generation. He's gone now, Frank Pollard. He was for so many years the pastor of First Baptist Church of Jackson, Mississippi, and then later became president of Golden Gate Seminary here in California. Anyway, Pollard was a tremendous, gifted preacher. He was chosen by Time magazine as one of the 10 most gifted preachers in America. He was the preacher for the Baptist Hour, which is heard around the world for many, many, many years. And toward the end of his life, he was being interviewed. And the interviewer asked him the question, how would you like to be remembered? And do you know what he said? He said, I don't want to be remembered. I'm just the messenger. That's what Jesus is talking about here. You want to truly be great, not as the world sees greatness, but as God sees it, then be a servant. When we were missionaries in Argentina, I did a number of things, but the very first assignment I was given, and it was by the Argentine Baptist Association there, they handed me a list, and it had 75 churches and missions on it. And they said, we want you to go visit these churches once a week. Some of them haven't had a pastor for years. Some of them we don't even know what kind of condition they're in now. Some of them may be doing well. Some of them may be really struggling. We want you to go visit them one by one. And 75, and there are 52 weeks in a year. I thought it'll take me maybe a year and a half. It actually took me 3.5 years because I'd go to one and then they'd ask me to come back several weeks. Sometimes there were churches that hadn't had a pastor in years and they had a list of people to baptize and so on. So many things to do. But one by one I started going to visit these churches. They were all small. The very largest among them had about 250 members. Some of them had just a hand full of people. And as I set out, I took the Argentine version of the Thomas Guide and set out to find these churches and go. And because it stretched out over a period of about 3.5 years, by the time I got to a lot of them, they knew already. They had heard that there's an American missionary going out to visit all of these churches. Most of the welcomes I got were great. Not all of them were. I got to one church and they were waiting for me. They thought I was a CIA agent. And everybody was on high alert that day. But that was atypical. Most of them welcomed me. By the time I got to some of the churches, I was already teaching part-time, teaching counseling at the Baptist Seminary there. And so this one particular day, I drove out to the outskirts of Buenos Aires where there are, I guess, what we would call shanty towns. In Spanish, they call them villages of misery. And that's a pretty apt description of what they were, the people who live in sometimes just little houses they've made themselves out of whatever they can gather and put together. Most of the neighborhoods don't have running water, they don't have electricity, there are no paved roads. It's bad. But I found this particular church and I pulled up there. And the pastor of that church, he had heard that an American missionary was coming. He didn't know I was coming that day. He didn't have a telephone. I couldn't call him and alert him to the fact that I was coming. So when I got there that day, he met me out front, and he was a nervous wreck. He said to me, I can't preach in front of you. He said, you're the missionary who teaches at the seminary, and I've never even been to school. He said, I'm just a humble man. And he said, I'm a carpenter. That's how I make my living. The church can't pay me, so I work as a carpenter. And he showed me the building where they met, their church. And he said, when I came to this neighborhood, there was no church. So I built this with my own hands. And he said, I live out behind it. And he took me out in the back, and there was a little tiny mobile home. And he said, that's where I live. I live out in the back there. Man, I said to him, first I asked him, I said, did you know that Jesus was a carpenter too, just like you? And he said, yeah, he knew that. And I said, brother, look, what you've done here, I couldn't do in 100 years. Building this building with your own hands so people would have a place to worship, not only could I not do this, I wouldn't even know where to start. The same God who called me called you. The same God who equipped me equipped you. And I told him, he had his Bible in his hand, and I took that Bible from him and I said, I want you to take this Bible and I want you to get up into that pulpit today. And I want you to preach the word. And I'll be praying for you, and I will be your best listener as you preach. Now, this man, I think of him from time to time. The world would look at that man and say, that's a nobody. But let me ask you a question. In the kingdom of God, isn't that a great man? That servant's heart, that humility that he has, is that not a great man in the kingdom of God? Is he not as great as the president of Argentina or the richest man in that country? In God's eyes, he is. And that's what Jesus is asking us to do today, is to stop thinking of greatness in terms of how the world thinks, which is always about power and wealth, and to start thinking of it in a radically new way. You want to be great in the kingdom of God? Then be a servant. Serve God, serve others. That's how we are great in God's kingdom. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 276, "O Jesus, I have promised."